Okay, the FMS vendor maintenance program. What we're going to do is we're going to go through all the individual screens from an individual vendor standpoint. To start off, we're going to go ahead and add a vendor. Click Add on the left-hand margin, and we're going to type in the vendor name, press Enter. We then presented with the first screen of the vendor maintenance screen. If we press Enter at this point, the system will highlight all the required fields. While these are the required fields, they're not necessarily all the fields that you would have to physically fill in. You can fill other information in as well. So we're going to start off with the address. City, state, country, United States, as well as Canada and other areas as well. Key in the zip code. Then we come down to the phone number, which is not required, but of course if you have it, you can physically key it in along with the extension. Next is the fax number. And then we come to the billing code. So the billing code is not required. However, whatever information is presented on this line will also print on the check stub itself. Vendors like telephone and utilities, it's good to put in your customer ID number there so it prints on the check. DSD vendor field, the sort code is actually placed down on this field. This field is used to cross-reference to your backdoor receiving system. So in this case, you'd actually put in the number at your backdoor receiving, not necessarily the FMS code. If you click here, you can see that you can have multiple backdoor receiving vendors numbers. Let's go ahead and plug in the payment type. Hit the drop down there. We have multiple choices. We can have ACH vendors, which you set the information up and go into the vendor's account and place the money there. You can have paid in cash if it's a COD vendor. The most popular choice here would be CK for printed check. The system will then generate a check. Direct deposit is not used with AP. That's a payroll function. We then have EF, which is electronic funds transfer, where the vendor actually comes into your account and grabs the money. And federal tax is not used here. It's used in the payroll system. So we're going to go ahead and pick check here for printed check. Next up is the terms code. You hit the little drop-down box, and you're presented with all the terms codes that exist in the system. Some of the more unique codes are these end-of-month codes where you can accumulate the invoices throughout a given month and then pay it a certain day of the next month. If you page down here, you can also see there's some standard code, net 9, net 10, pay in 10 days, whatever the case may be. And then we also have a full complement of discounts as well. So we'll go ahead and pick net 13 here. Moving on, the vendor type, we can hit the drop down. So we have 3 different types of vendors. We can have a central bill vendor. So those are the vendors that deliver directly to your store but are billed through a third party. Then here are the wholesaler type vendors where your actual wholesaler delivers a multitude of goods and then you pay them based on a statement or you pay them based on a check, whatever the case may be. And then we have the DSD COD. So those are ones that are received at your back door that you pay cash or money order for. The most common type is going to be blank, and again, those are the ones that are just going to be standard check, no special consideration given. The next field is the activity status. It defaults to A for active. If we hit the drop down, you can make the vendor inactive, which will no longer allow you to key invoices to that vendor, but any existing invoices that are in the system will automatically be paid. We also have the little checkbox here for hold or unhold. If you place a vendor on hold, it will allow you to continue to key invoices. However, none of those invoices will be paid unless you go into individual invoices and take them off of hold. So once I'm done with the first screen, if I press Enter, the system will feed me over to page 2. The only required field on page 2 is the 1099 code. If I hit the drop down here, it lists all the various types of 1099s. The most common selection here is not applicable. However, if it is a 1099 type vendor, you can select non-employee compensation, which is another popular choice. If you put in the 1099 code, you then want to enter the tax code. This could either be the Social Security number if this is an individual, or it could be the federal ID number if this is a corporation. We also have the ability to track the W-9 pending date. So if you've sent out a W-9 to request that tax ID number and you're given the vendor 30 days or whatever, you could physically plug in a date, and then the system will prompt you then when you're ready if you haven't received that tax ID number. You can also flag the vendor as a use taxable vendor to be run at the end of the period to calculate use tax on any of the invoices that have been received for that vendor. These other choices are not commonly used, but I'll spend a minute on each one. The verification code is like a password. If you have multiple vendors that are very similar, you can set a password so they can only be used if you know the physical password. So if you have multiple Coca-Cola bottlers, for example, you may want to put one store uses one and another uses a second. You can put little passwords in here so you make sure you get the proper coding when you're keying invoices in. If you're using retail accounting, you can plug a gross profit percentage in here, and all the invoices for this given vendor will be marked up accordingly to get you to this gross profit level. You would prefer to have the actual retail that you key the invoices in, but if you have a vendor that doesn't provide those retails or they're hand extended or something like that, you can physically key in the percentage. Down here we can physically group our vendors. So you can select something off of the list, as like for service vendors or whatever the type of merchandise they bring in. We're then able to run reports across the vendor file to give you that grouping. You can also run outstanding list and other such reports across that same group level. Next up is the bank code. In certain circumstances, you may want to pay a specific vendor out of a separate bank account. So to do that, you would physically just hit the drop-down box and then pick an account off the list. So when you run your standard check runs, anything for this particular vendor will be cut off of this bank account, not your standard AP account. You can also flag your vendor to create a separate check for every invoice. So if you turn this option on, every single invoice will be cut on a separate check. This is very popular for garnishments and child support where you may have multiple people paying to the same jurisdiction. To the right, we have two user-definable fields so that you can put whatever type of data that you want in those fields. And again, through the Empower Report Writer, you can access those fields to pull them on reports for vendors. So if I filter everything in, if I press enter, if it likes everything, I'll get the confirmation prompt. If I see something that I wanted to change, I could hit the cancel button and go back and make the appropriate change. So for example, I don't want to have this as a separate check, so I'll come back and say no. Press enter again, it likes everything, I click OK. It moves me to the next field. This is where it allows me to put multiple DSD vendor numbers into a single accounts payable vendor. So if you have two different distributors bringing Frito chips, for example, at the back door they have separate numbers. You can put them on and have them pay out of one specific AP vendor. So I'm going to go and click OK. Brings me to the next screen. This is the screen where you can plug in the authorized accounts. If you leave this table blank, this vendor will be able to get charged to any account and department that you want. If you want to lock it into a single department, you do so here. The first field is default, whether you want to default that on the entry screen of AP. So if you want to see that department and account when you go to key the invoice in, you can say yes. You can then key in the department and the account. If you press enter, it will accept it. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel here so you can see it goes out and pulls in the department and the account from the chart of accounts. So now any invoices for this vendor FMS will automatically be charged to grocery and purchases. This does two things for you. One, it makes sure that you're doing the coding properly so FMS doesn't get coded to an incorrect department account. It also speeds up the data entry as well, since when you're keying the invoice in, you don't have to physically key in the department and the account. It will automatically provide it for you. If I press enter, if it likes everything, I get the confirmation prompt. I click OK. It takes me to the next screen. The next screen is the list of stores. So now I have to pick the stores that are authorized to deal with this vendor. So if you have stores in multiple states, maybe this is a Texas type vendor and the stores in Oklahoma do not use this one. If that is the case, you would just pick the Texas stores on this list. To select a store, you can highlight it and hit the select button. You can also double click on the store as well. So if you just go down the list and pick the stores that you want to have approved to deal with this vendor. The system will not allow you to key an invoice into this vendor for one of these stores that are not highlighted. If you put the store number in the invoice entry screen, this vendor will not even be presented on your list of approved stores. So now I'll hit the back to go forward. The next screen is the vendor addresses. So you can have multiple addresses. The addresses we put on the first page is what's going to print on the face of the check. So that's going to be the mail to. But in some cases, if there's a home office or if there's a salesman's address or any other address you want to keep track of, I'll go ahead and click on that so you can get a feel for it. So you can put in the attention to and all this information, including the phone number of the other address. You can track unlimited addresses in this field. So moving on to the next screen is the vendor comments. Again, you have an unlimited spacing for putting comments in. Whatever you key in here will actually stay with the vendor forever. You can also report on this field as well. So you could actually put in something like delivery days, Monday and Friday. I press enter, I get the confirmation prompt. If I click OK there, it brings me to the next screen. This is where you physically can put in multiple gross profits for this given vendor based on the department. So if this vendor brought you grocery merchandise and frozen merchandise, you could say mark the grocery up 25% and then mark the frozen up 32%, for example. So now we can go forward. Vendor contacts, again, we had vendor addresses where you can add multiple addresses. Here's where you can physically add in additional contacts. So the salesman, for example. So if I wanted to put something in here, I could type in the person's name and I can put in their title. And then if I had their email address, you can put that information in there as well. And then you can have multiple email addresses as well. As I press enter, I get the confirmation prompt. I can click OK. Moves me to the next screen, which is the contact screen where it lets you fill in additional information, such as multiple phone numbers for that individual contact. If there's nothing that you want to change, we can go ahead and press enter. We get the confirmation prompt and click OK, moving to the next screen. You can, again, add multiple contacts for a given vendor. The last screen here is the ACH screen. So if you were actually going to send through your bank payment to this vendor, you would require to put the vendor's ABA number, which is usually a 9-digit number, and then their account number as well. And then you put in the account type, which in most cases would be checking. Then you have the bank flag. When you first set the vendor up and you're using it for the first time, you want to make sure that you pre-note. So you would generally do pre-note and create check. That way the system will physically cut a paper check and you can send a 0 into the individual's account to make sure that you have the account number and the ABA number correct. You also need to tell the system whether that's a corporation or an individual. In some cases, clients use this for employee expense reimbursements. If that was the case, you would actually pick P here instead of C. Then we have the choice to physically go ahead and create the remit address or the remit and email it out. So remember, you don't have a paper check, so you need to let the vendor know what invoices you're paying. So again, this is where you would put the FMS's vendor email address. So whatever that case may be. So when the physical check is cut, or in this case when the ACH is created, all the invoices that are being paid will be put on an email via Adobe, and you can physically send it out. Okay, I press enter. If it likes everything, you get the confirmation prompt. and it brings you to the edit additional email addresses for the ACH, and you can click OK through that, and then you're back to the add vendor screen. If we hit exit here, it brings us back to our list. If we wanted to look up the vendor, you type in the first few letters of the vendor and press enter. So you can see there was already one present. If I highlight the vendor, all the buttons then become ungrayed, and we can go into the individual screens. So to make a change to a vendor, we're going to go ahead and click edit, and there's all the physical data that we keyed into the system. You can see there's page 1 and then page 2. Over on the left-hand margin, these are all the other screens that came up when we went and added the vendor, as far as the authorized accounts, ACH information, comments, contacts, addresses. On this side also is where you have the 1099 information, so if you click on that, you can physically go in and manually add 1099 amounts to that given vendor. Going back, if you forgot to authorize a store or you have new stores, you physically can come into a vendor, click on the vendor stores, and physically pick a store that can now do business with that vendor. One last thing with the vendor file itself, you can highlight the vendor and you can click on options. So at the individual store level, you can go in and add multiple accounts. So if I go into overrides, for example, if you wanted to allow duplicate invoices for this vendor only, you could turn that on. A system option is to not allow duplicate invoices or duplicate credit numbers. Authorized payment from statement, so if it's a statement type vendor, you would physically authorize right here by double clicking on it and saying OK at the prompt. And now this vendor would be authorized for payments for statements, so you'd have to go through a small statement reconciliation program in order to get the invoices paid. You can also stop DSD from posting to a given vendor if for some reason you don't want to accept that into the AP system. You can also post through the DSD system the rebates into the receivable module. You can also print the tax information on the check, and then you can also print zero invoices on the check as well in the event that you voided an invoice and it had a zero amount that you could print on the check. So going back, we go back into the option screen one more time, and you can see some of the other choices here are the same things that you can access on the left-hand side on the edit screen, the authorized accounts, acquisitions, addresses, and contacts. One last thing, if we go into the vendor and we go to authorized stores, you can also set an authorized at the store level. So if we edit the overrides, you can override the AP account. So for some reason, if you wanted this to post to like a clearing account, you could set it up for just this store to post to an alternative AP account. Maybe that's AP wholesaler or AP central bill, something like that. You can also override the terms for just this store, and then it also keeps track of the purchases here in these two accounts, and these are used for 1099s. Extract to PC is no longer used. So that, in a nutshell, is the AP vendor screen.